we know or we are told?
Don't you know?
Okay, let's go back a little bit here. The president in his speech described the pillars on which the 2012 budget were built. Said they're built on 4 pillars: macroeconomic stability, structural reforms, governance, and institutions. And then he said something about continuing with those 4 pillars in the 2013 budget. Do you think it's viable to continue on that trend?
I'm sure you yourself probably don't understand what those pillars are. It's good to say, but whatever the pillars are, the important thing is that would the proposed structure or reform or whatever bring about growth in the economy? And my answer is no. Quite simply no. Apart from the fact that you have this flood situation, which is going to, how do I say, reduce the amount of agricultural output and things like that, possibly for the first few months, for the next few months, and possibly into some part of the new year. You find that the amount of money we're talking about is absolutely insufficient, inadequate, in order to be able to transform our economy, because the job of the federal government or the government is not really to create jobs, or to create an enabling environment that would make it possible for the private sector to create jobs. So the pillars you're talking about may be said to achieve these objectives, but you cannot achieve those objectives without addressing the issues of interest rate and inflation. These are the critical aspects, and a lot of people don't seem to understand that. That also affects our cost of borrowing, significantly so, especially when we have a monetary team that is happy to borrow money it doesn't need at up to 12%. I think we should give them an award for that, and we wonder why our debt burden is rising. For example, we read from the budget that the amount of debt accumulation has been gradually reducing, and it will reduce further in the 2013 budget. But interestingly, the Debt Management Office itself would probably have created close to 1 trillion naira in debt at the end of this year. The debt burden has been rising at a rate of about 1 trillion every year since 2007, when it was barely below 1 trillion. That's domestic debt, that is. And so we have a situation where, in fact, surprisingly and inexplicably, it has become evident that there has been no plan for the redemption of any of these debts. And we have what they call a debt management office. That's why often I call it a debt creation office. And they're talking about 100 billion sinking fund for this purpose. A sinking fund for debt of 5 trillion or so, thereabouts, not to account for that of 1.7 trillion that is AMCOM generated debt, even though AMCOM's total debt is quite close to 5 trillion. So I don't see why they should distinguish and say 1.7 trillion is government-backed. Since AMCOM is a creation of government, so really what I'm saying is we should probably be looking at a debt burden of not 5 trillion, possibly of about 10 trillion at the moment, all because of an inappropriate and reckless monetary policy framework that is designed to make us poor when we get rich. And that's rather regrettable.
Well, we're taking a look at the revenue generation itself. I mean, aside the fact that we have an oil benchmark of $75 per barrel, and on the total we're expecting about a little over 10 trillion naira in this budget,
close to 11.
Even though we're spending just about 4.9, about 5 trillion naira of that. Do you think that we could have earned more?
I think that's what I explained initially, that 10.8 is obviously a very conservative figure, because with the performance so far of the Customs and Excise Service, which I said, hopefully, if they could do 5 trillion, 400 billion by the end of August, September, we could expect that they would do 500 billion or something like that. And there's no reason why that shouldn't be carried over as a performance target for next year. By the same token, I'm saying that the Federal Inland Revenue Service achieved a total of about 4-point-something trillion, quite close to 5 trillion, as of September. So there's no reason why we shouldn't expect also that to go to 5 or 6 trillion. And that also can be projected into the next year's budget. And there's no reason why not if we're expecting growth. Okay? So those two together constitute already close to 6 trillion naira.
But we don't seem to be taking cognizance of that in the budget.
I don't know why they are not recognizing this, because as I've said earlier, traditionally, the budget usually comprises 80% crude oil receipts or whatever, and internally. But we now have a situation where internally generated revenue is given a good fight. Are we now saying it's 50-50 or what? You know, but if we now extrapolate and say, out of that 10.8 billion, 10.84 trillion, 80% of that is crude oil receipts, then we're saying that local, internally generated revenue is only about 3 trillion, which from the facts on the ground do not gel. And consequently, we would have what? A projected deficit when we shouldn't even have a deficit. Indeed, it's a very curious and bizarre monetary management style that you say, let's have a conservative benchmark, crude oil price. And then you put on that benchmark, and then you say, oh, we have a deficit. But fortuitously, the crude oil benchmark price is often exceeded. So you would expect that you wouldn't need the deficit. That doesn't stop the DMO from continuing to borrow. So you have a situation where we really don't have the need for a deficit, but somehow it seems like a policy fixation that we must incur debt, which is rather unfortunate and tragic, because I don't see why we should be in debt at all, especially when we cannot also see any physical evidence of what some of these monies have been used for. A budget that says, look, we believe in the people, we are going to do something for the people. You know the budget ratio in Lagos State? It's 40% recurrent expenditure and 60% capital. I mean, that's...
Is it feasible to truly cut it that way? Because a host of people have made reference to the fact that right now we're doing 68.7% in terms of recurrent and just what's left as capital expenditure. And it seems that the federal government is bent on making the gradual adjustments in terms of increasing capital expenditure. But a host of people expect that it will be a little more drastic. Is it feasible?
Well, put it this way. Maybe I should throw a question to you and say, do you think that the level of wastage in public expenditure, 10% would be appropriate, or 20% or 30% or even 50% wastage and corruption in the system? If you had the knife, for example, and you had the system, would you be looking at 10% cut in corruption or 10% cut in contract wastages and this type of thing? We all believe that there's a humongous corruption and wastage level in the system, and we shouldn't be talking of 2% reduction rates and things like that in recurrent expenditure. The amounts of monies that have been recovered in various public transactions and things like this, you'll find that these monies are often not reflected in any budget statement.